The courtroom was packed. Rows of people filled the benches, the air thick with tension. Lawyers whispered to their clients, reporters typed notes into their laptops, and the judge, a woman known for her strict rulings, sat high above it all, her gavel resting near her hand. To everyone else, this was just another foster care hearing, another teenager lost in the system, another case number on a long list of forgotten names. But Kennedy James knew better. She wasn't just another foster kid, she was someone's secret, and today that secret was coming out. Her palms were sweaty as she stood up slowly, her heart slamming against her ribs. The judge hadn't even looked at her yet. She was too busy flipping through papers preparing for the next case. Kennedy swallowed hard, then she spoke. "You're my mom." The entire courtroom froze. Judge Naomi Carter looked up so fast it was like she'd been shot. The gavel slipped from her hand, clattering against the wooden desk. The sound echoed in the stunned silence, bouncing off the marble walls. Kennedy saw it. The flicker in the judge's eyes. For just 1 second, before she masked it with a sharp glare, there was recognition. Then came the denial. "What did you just say?" Naomi's voice was sharp, but Kennedy could hear the crack beneath it. The courtroom was no longer a courtroom, it was a pressure cooker about to explode. Kennedy's throat felt dry, but she pushed forward. "You heard me," she said, voice steadier this time. "I said, you're my mom." Gasps spread through the room like wildfire. Reporters whispered into their mics, lawyers glanced at each other in shock, and even the court stenographer stopped typing. Judge Carter's expression hardened. "This is a court of law," she snapped, "not a place for baseless accusations." But Kennedy didn't back down. She reached into her backpack and pulled out the document that had changed her life forever. A birth certificate. She walked straight up to the bench and slammed it onto the desk. The paper slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from Naomi Carter's trembling fingers. Her name was right there, black and white, undeniable. Naomi Carter, listed under Mother. Kennedy heard the gasps behind her. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. She had proof. And now, so did the rest of the world. The judge stared at the paper like it was a ghost, like if she looked at it long enough it would disappear. But it didn't. Kennedy leaned in, lowering her voice so only Naomi could hear. "You can say I'm lying. You can try to ignore this," she whispered, "but the truth is right there." For the first time in her career, Judge Naomi Carter was speechless. Her mouth opened, closed. Her hands, always so steady when delivering verdicts, shook. Kennedy didn't blink. "You gave me up," she said. "Now tell me why." Boom. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters jumped to their feet. Lawyers rushed forward. The bailiff moved toward Kennedy, but she didn't flinch. She had already won. Because she saw it in Naomi Carter's eyes. The truth was out. And now there was no turning back. The courtroom was still buzzing with noise. Lawyers whispered, reporters scrambled for their cameras, and a few people in the audience were frantically texting, no doubt spreading the story. But Kennedy wasn't focused on any of that. Her eyes were locked on Judge Naomi Carter, the woman who had just been exposed as her mother. For the first time in her life, Naomi looked shaken. She had spent years controlling this courtroom, passing judgments, deciding fates, handing out sentences. But now, she sat frozen, her grip tightening around the wooden bench as if she could hold on to the last bit of control she had left. Her lips parted like she was about to say something. But she didn't. She just stared at the birth certificate lying on the desk in front of her, the document that held the truth she had spent 14 years hiding. Kennedy's chest rose and fell, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The seconds dragged on. Then Naomi's expression hardened. She straightened her posture, squared her shoulders, and when she spoke, her voice was ice cold. "This is a court of law, not a place for theatrics," she snapped, looking away from Kennedy like she was just another unruly witness. "Bailiff, remove her from the stand. The betrayal hit like a slap. Kennedy felt her stomach twist. Even now, after everything, Naomi was still pretending, still acting like Kennedy didn't exist. The bailiff stepped toward her. Kennedy refused to move. "No," she said, her voice strong. "I'm not leaving." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Somewhere in the back, a reporter whispered, "Oh, this is about to get messy." Naomi's eyes flickered with something sharp. Anger, frustration, maybe even fear, but she kept her face blank. "There is a process for these kinds of claims," she said, her words clipped and controlled. "If you have evidence—" "I just gave you evidence." Kennedy cut her off. She pointed to the birth certificate. Naomi clenched her jaw. "This could be forged." Kennedy scoffed. "Then take a DNA test." The courtroom went dead silent. A single heartbeat of pure tension. Naomi Carter, one of the toughest judges in the state, one of the most respected women in law, was just challenged in her own courtroom. Kennedy saw it. The flicker of hesitation. The slight panic behind Naomi's carefully constructed mask. She was trapped. If she refused the test, she would look guilty. But if she took it, the whole world would know the truth. Kennedy stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough that only Naomi could hear. "You know it's true," she whispered. "So why are you still lying?" Naomi's fingers curled into fists. Then she did something no one expected. She grabbed the gavel, slammed it against the desk, and stood up. "This hearing is over." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Lawyers jumped from their seats. The bailiff tried to control the growing noise, but it was too late. Naomi Carter turned on her heel and walked straight for the exit. Kennedy watched her go, feeling a strange mix of victory and fury rise inside her. She had forced Naomi's hand, but Naomi was still running, still hiding. Kennedy clenched her fists. Not for long. She wasn't going to let her escape this time. Kennedy sat on her bed, staring at the birth certificate in her hands. She had read it 100 times already, tracing the ink with her fingers, memorizing every word. Her mother's name, Naomi Carter. Right there in black and white. She had spent her whole life wondering who she was. Now she finally knew. But the real question was why? Why had Naomi abandoned her? Why had she never tried to find her? And most importantly, why did she look so scared? A knock at the door pulled Kennedy from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m. Who the hell would be visiting this late? Her stomach twisted as she stood. A bad feeling crawled up her spine. She walked toward the door, hesitated for just a second, then looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, her brows furrowed. Another knock, louder. Her pulse spiked. She swallowed hard and slowly unlocked the door, cracking it open just an inch. A single envelope lay on the floor. No name, no return address. Her hands shook as she picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. 4 words. Stop looking for her. Kennedy's blood ran cold. Her hands tightened around the paper. Someone was watching her. Someone didn't want her digging into Naomi's past, but they had no idea who they were dealing with, because Kennedy wasn't stopping. She was just getting started. The letter in Kennedy's hands felt heavier than it should have. She read the words over and over, her fingers tightening around the paper. Stop looking for her. Her first instinct was to storm out of her apartment and start knocking on doors. Someone had left this. Someone knew what she was digging into. But she forced herself to think. No name, no return address, not even an envelope seal. Whoever sent this had planned it carefully. Her phone buzzed. A message from Deja, her best friend. Deja. Yo, I saw the news. What did you do? Kennedy exhaled. The whole city had seen what happened in court. She wasn't just another girl in foster care anymore. She was the girl who called out a judge on live TV. And now she was being warned to stop. But stopping had never been her style. She grabbed her phone and typed back, "Kennedy, meet me at Jace's. I need backup." A few seconds later, Deja replied, "Deja, I got you. Be there in 10. Kennedy shoved the note into her backpack and threw on a hoodie. If someone thought a piece of paper was going to scare her off, they were dead wrong. Jace's was the only place in town that never closed. A small, greasy diner on the edge of the city, where truck drivers, cops, and late-night drunks all mixed together. Kennedy pushed through the door, the smell of burnt coffee and old bacon hitting her instantly. She spotted Deja sitting in the corner booth, scrolling through her phone. Across from her was Jace, the owner, a 40-something ex-military guy who knew how to keep secrets. Kennedy slid into the seat. Jace raised an eyebrow. "Well, if it isn't the most wanted girl in town." Deja snorted. "Girl, you broke the internet." Kennedy ignored them and pulled out the note, sliding it across the table. Jace picked it up and frowned. Anonymous threats. Classic. Deja's eyes widened. "Oh, hell no. You think Naomi sent this?" Kennedy shook her head. Number she was too busy running out of the courtroom like her feet were on fire. Deja leaned in. "Then who?" Jace exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "I don't know, but if someone's trying to scare you, it means you're close to something big." Kennedy nodded. "Which means I need to dig deeper." Jace sighed. "I knew you were going to say that." He slid his phone across the table. "So, I did some digging of my own." Kennedy grabbed the phone. The screen showed an old news article. She scanned the headline. "Local lawyer loses custody case amid controversy." Kennedy's pulse spiked. She skimmed through the article, her eyes catching on a name buried in the text. Naomi Carter. Her stomach flipped. Deja leaned over. "What does it say?" Kennedy's fingers tightened around the phone. "It says my mom, Naomi Carter, lost a custody case 14 years ago." Deja blinked. "Wait, what?" Jace nodded. "And guess what? The records of that case? Sealed." Kennedy's jaw clenched. Someone had erased everything. "Who was the case against?" she asked, scrolling to the bottom of the article. Jace shook his head. "That's the thing. There's no name, just a private party." Kennedy's blood ran cold. Someone with power and money had gone out of their way to make sure this case disappeared. Deja sat back, arms crossed. "Okay, so let's break this down. Naomi had a custody battle over you when you were a baby. She lost. Someone took you, and instead of fighting, she just let it happen?" Kennedy frowned. Number she didn't just let it happen. She pointed to the article. "She tried to fight, but someone stopped her." Silence stretched across the table. Jace leaned back in his chair, his face grim. "You sure you want to keep digging?" Kennedy looked him straight in the eye. "I have to." By the time Kennedy and Deja left the diner, the city was quiet. Streetlights buzzed. The air smelled like rain. Kennedy pulled her hoodie over her head. Her mind was racing. Who had fought Naomi for custody? And why had Naomi never spoken about it? She pulled out her phone, snapping a picture of the article. "We need to find out who filed that case," she said. Deja sighed. "Great. So now we're going to break into sealed court records?" Kennedy smirked. "If that's what it takes." They turned onto an empty street. A car engine rumbled somewhere behind them. Kennedy glanced over her shoulder. A black sedan was parked across the street. It had tinted windows. The engine was running. But no one got out. Kennedy felt the hairs on her arms rise. Deja noticed, too. That car wasn't there before." Kennedy's gut twisted. She grabbed Deja's arm. "Let's move." They walked faster. The car didn't move. Didn't turn its lights on. Didn't roll down its windows. It just sat there, watching. Kennedy's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Whoever was in that car, they weren't here by accident. She wasn't just digging into Naomi Carter's past anymore. She was being watched. Kennedy didn't turn around. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but that would only confirm she was scared. And she couldn't afford to be scared. Deja whispered, "Tell me I'm tripping." "You're not," Kennedy muttered. "Keep walking." The sedan's engine hummed low, steady. No headlights, no movement. Whoever was inside was waiting for something. Or someone. Kennedy grabbed Deja's wrist and steered her toward the corner, forcing her steps to stay calm. "What's the plan?" Deja asked under her breath. Kennedy's mind raced. She had two options. Go home and pretend this never happened, or find out who was watching her. She chose the second. "There's an alley up ahead. We cut through, double back, and get behind them," Kennedy said. Deja groaned. "Girl, this is exactly how people get kidnapped in movies." Kennedy ignored her. They turned the corner fast and darted into the alley. Dark. Quiet. Trash cans lined the walls, a flickering streetlight barely lighting the way. The scent of old grease and damp concrete filled the air. Kennedy crouched near a dumpster, her pulse hammering. She counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Then she peeked around the edge. The sedan hadn't moved. Deja exhaled. "Maybe we're paranoid." Kennedy's gut told her otherwise. A second later, the driver's door cracked open. A figure stepped out. Tall, broad shoulders, dark coat. Kennedy's breath hitched. She couldn't make out his face in the dim light, but the way he moved, slow, deliberate, cautious, told her one thing. He wasn't lost. He was looking for them. Kennedy pulled Deja lower behind the dumpster. "What do we do?" Deja whispered. Kennedy's heart pounded. She needed to see his face. She grabbed her phone and opened the camera. Carefully, she raised it over the dumpster and snapped a photo. The shutter sound was louder than she expected. Kennedy's stomach dropped. The man's head snapped in their direction. For a second, nothing happened. Then he moved, fast, straight toward them. "Run!" Kennedy shoved Deja ahead, sprinting toward the other end of the alley. Footsteps thundered behind them. Kennedy didn't look back. She hit the sidewalk and veered left, pushing through a group of late-night pedestrians. The man didn't follow. By the time she stopped running, they were 2 blocks away. Breathing hard, Kennedy pulled out her phone. The picture was blurry, dark. But one thing was clear. The man had a scar down his left cheek. Kennedy swallowed hard. She didn't know who he was, but he knew her, and he wasn't done watching. Kennedy's hands trembled as she stared at the blurry photo on her phone. The man's face was shadowed, but that scar, the jagged line running down his left cheek, that was a detail she wouldn't forget. Deja was pacing beside her, breath still ragged from the sprint. "Okay, tell me again why we're not calling the cops." Kennedy exhaled. "Because they won't do anything. They'll say we're paranoid, that it's just some random guy on the street." Deja threw her hands up. "But it's not some random guy. He was watching us. You saw how fast he moved when he heard your camera." Kennedy's fingers curled around her phone. She knew. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't just some stranger on the street. He had been waiting for her. Kennedy took a shaky breath. "We need to find out who he is." Deja groaned. "Oh, so we're just skipping straight to the part where we play detective?" Kennedy didn't answer. She was already typing a message to Jace. "Kennedy, I need a name. Scar on his left cheek. Tall, black sedan. Could be connected to Naomi Carter." A minute later, Jace responded. "Jace. Damn, you really don't do normal problems, huh? Give me a few hours." Kennedy locked her phone. Few hours. She could wait. But deep in her gut, she felt it. Time was running out. The next morning, Kennedy sat at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone when a news alert popped up. "Breaking. Judge Naomi Carter releases statement following courtroom shocker. Kennedy's stomach flipped. She tapped the link. A grainy video loaded. A row of reporters. Naomi Carter standing at a podium, her expression as unreadable as ever. Then she spoke. "There have been many false claims made against me in the past 24 hours, she said, her voice controlled, clipped. "I want to make one thing clear. I have no biological children." Kennedy's blood turned to ice. No biological children. She had denied her completely. Deja, who had been eating cereal across from her, choked. No way, number way. Kennedy couldn't breathe. Her own mother had just erased her on national television. She pressed play again, watching Naomi's face closely. She was lying. Kennedy could see it. The slight tension in her jaw. The way she didn't look directly at the cameras. But to the rest of the world, she had just slammed the door on the story. She had just officially buried Kennedy. And that meant one thing. Naomi Carter was more desperate than she wanted people to believe. Kennedy's fingers tightened around her phone. If Naomi was going to act like she didn't exist, fine. She'd make her see her. She'd force her to tell the truth. No matter what it took. Later that night, Jace finally called. Kennedy answered on the first ring. "Tell me you got something," she said. Jace sighed. "I got something." Kennedy straightened. "Who is he?" There was a pause. Then, Darius Wright. The name meant nothing to her. Jace continued. "Ex-private investigator. Used to work cases for high-profile lawyers. Then, a few years ago, he just disappeared. No employment records, no addresses, nothing." Kennedy frowned. "And now he's following me?" Jace hesitated. "Not just you." Kennedy's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Jace exhaled. "He's been linked to Naomi Carter, years ago, right around the time you were born." Kennedy's grip on the phone tightened. A man who had worked with Naomi. A man who had disappeared from public records. A man who was now watching her. It wasn't a coincidence. Kennedy felt a chill crawl up her spine. She had pushed too far. And now, someone was pushing back. Kennedy sat frozen, the name Darius Wright echoing in her head. A man from Naomi Carter's past. A man who had disappeared. A man who was now following her. None of this was a coincidence. Jace's voice came through the phone again, low and serious. "I ran his name through every public database I could. The dude is a ghost. No social media, no bank records, nothing in the past 10 years. Kennedy swallowed hard. "Then how do we even know he's real?" Jace sighed. "Because he wasn't always a ghost. Before he vanished, he worked private security. Guess who his last known client was?" Kennedy already knew the answer before Jace said it. Naomi Carter. Deja, who had been listening on speaker, cursed under her breath. "You're telling me this dude used to work for your mom?" Kennedy's fingers curled into fists. "And now, he's following me." Silence. Then Jace spoke, his voice lower. "There's more." Kennedy braced herself. "What?" Jace hesitated, then said, "Before Naomi became a judge, she was a defense attorney. And she wasn't just any lawyer. She handled a case that went completely off the record." Kennedy's chest tightened. "What kind of case?" Jace hesitated. "I don't know. There's nothing in the system. But I found something weird in old newspaper archives. There was a fire at a law firm she used to work at. Records were lost. The case she was working on. Gone." Kennedy's pulse spiked. A fire. Destroyed records. A sealed past. This wasn't just about her. This was about something bigger. Kennedy barely slept. She lay awake, replaying Naomi's words on the news. "I have no biological children." Lies. But why? Why was she still running? By morning, Kennedy had made up her mind. She was going to see Naomi Carter face to face. No cameras, no courtrooms, no reporters. Just the truth. Deja wasn't happy about it. "You really think she's just going to tell you everything?" she asked as they stood outside Naomi Carter's house. Kennedy stared at the front door of the massive white mansion behind the iron gates. "I don't think she has a choice," Kennedy said. Deja sighed. "Girl, you are playing with fire." Kennedy ignored her and rang the doorbell. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door swung open. Naomi Carter stood in the doorway, her face unreadable. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then Naomi's lips parted, and she said something Kennedy never expected. "You need to leave. Now." Kennedy's breath hitched. "I just want answers." Naomi's eyes darted toward the street, her expression tight. "It's not safe." Kennedy's pulse spiked. "What are you talking about?" Naomi's jaw clenched. "Darius Wright, he's watching." Kennedy froze. So she knew. Naomi swallowed hard. "I did what I had to do to protect you, but if you keep digging, you're going to get yourself killed." Kennedy's blood ran cold. "What did you do?" she whispered. Naomi looked at her, eyes full of something Kennedy had never seen before. Regret. And then, just as quickly, Naomi shut the door in her face. Kennedy stood there, breathless, heart pounding. She had pushed too far, and now the truth was finally trying to push back. Kennedy stood on Naomi Carter's doorstep, her heart hammering in her chest. The door had slammed shut in her face, but it wasn't the rejection that rattled her. It was the fear in Naomi's voice. "I did what I had to do to protect you. If you keep digging, you're going to get yourself killed." Kennedy's stomach twisted. Naomi wasn't just denying their connection. She was warning her. And if Judge Naomi Carter, one of the most powerful women in the city, was scared, then who the hell was she scared of? Deja grabbed her wrist. "Kennedy, we need to go. Now." Kennedy blinked, snapping out of her daze. She followed Deja back down the driveway, but the feeling of being watched crawled up her spine. Someone was here. Someone was waiting. She could feel it. She turned her head slightly, just enough to scan the street. A black sedan was parked 2 houses down. The same car. The one from last night. Kennedy's blood ran cold. Deja saw it too. "Oh, hell no," she muttered. "That's him, isn't it?" Kennedy didn't answer. She kept walking, forcing herself not to run. Not to panic. Not to let them know she was scared. They barely made it halfway down the block when the car door opened. Kennedy's pulse spiked. A tall figure stepped out. Darius Wright. The scar on his cheek was even more pronounced in the daylight. His eyes locked onto Kennedy, unblinking, calculating. He wasn't just watching now. He was moving. "Kennedy, run!" Deja's voice barely registered before Kennedy's feet were already hitting the pavement. She bolted, her breath sharp in her throat. Footsteps pounded behind her. Heavy. Fast. She turned a corner, nearly colliding with a trash bin, but didn't stop. Didn't look back. But she could hear him. Getting closer. They sprinted toward a convenience store at the end of the street. The neon "Open 24 hours" sign flickered in the window. Kennedy didn't hesitate. She crashed through the door, Deja right behind her. The cashier, a bald guy in his 40s, looked up from behind the counter, startled. "Whoa, what's the rush?" Kennedy spun around, chest heaving. Darius Wright was gone. No sign of him outside, no black sedan. Just an empty sidewalk. Like he had never been there at all. Deja doubled over, gasping for breath. "Okay, remind me. Why are we not calling the cops again?" Kennedy didn't answer. Her mind was spinning. Darius Wright had caught up to her, but he hadn't touched her. Hadn't spoken, hadn't tried to grab her. He just let her run. Which meant he wanted her scared. He wanted her to know he was watching. Her hands clenched into fists. Enough. She wasn't playing this game anymore. If Darius Wright wanted her to stop digging, then that meant one thing. There was something still buried, and she was going to find it. Back at Jace's diner, Kennedy planted herself in a booth, her laptop open, searching for anything she could find on Naomi Carter's past. She scrolled through article after article. Old cases, legal wins, public speeches. Nothing personal. Naomi Carter had wiped herself clean. But Jace had been right about one thing. There had been a fire. A law office burned down 14 years ago. The same time Naomi was fighting a custody battle. The same time John F. Kennedy was born. She clicked the article. No survivors. All case files destroyed. Investigation ruled accidental. Kennedy's throat tightened. This wasn't just a missing record. Someone had erased everything, and Naomi Carter had been right in the middle of it. She exhaled, forcing herself to think. She needed to go to the source. She needed Naomi's old law firm records, and she knew exactly where to find them. At midnight, Kennedy stood outside the abandoned law firm. The building had been gutted, windows boarded up, left to rot. Deja crossed her arms. This is the dumbest idea you've ever had. Kennedy ignored her and pulled out a crowbar. Deja groaned. Yup, definitely the dumbest. The door lock was rusted. It gave way with a loud crack. They slipped inside. The air was thick with dust. The walls were blackened from the fire, papers still littering the floor, charred, unreadable. But Kennedy wasn't looking for loose papers. She was looking for a safe, a hidden file, anything that wasn't destroyed. She moved carefully, stepping over debris, shining her phone flashlight into the shadows. Then she saw it. A filing cabinet, half burned, but locked. Kennedy crouched down, running her fingers along the metal. This was too heavy to have been moved after the fire, which meant it had been here before everything burned. Her heart pounded. She pulled out a pocket knife and jammed it into the lock. Metal snapped. The drawer slid open. A single folder sat inside, untouched by fire. Kennedy's hands shook as she lifted it. She flipped it open. And then she stopped breathing, because right there, inside the folder, was a photograph. A baby, wrapped in a hospital blanket. Her. Kennedy's head swam. This wasn't just a case file. This was proof that someone had tried to erase her. And at the bottom of the page, in bold black ink, was a name. Not Naomi Carter. A man's name. Kennedy whispered it out loud. Darius Wright. The man who had been following her. The man who had disappeared. The man who had tried to erase her entire existence. Her blood ran ice cold. And then a footstep echoed behind her. Kennedy froze. A footstep. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from behind her. She barely had time to shove the file into her backpack before another step echoed through the burned-out law firm. Then another. Closer. Deja grabbed her wrist, whispering, "We need to go. Now." Kennedy's breath was shallow, her heart hammering so loud she could barely hear. But she didn't move. She turned her head slowly, just enough to glimpse the shadow stretching across the floor. Tall, broad, unmistakable, Darius Wright. He was blocking the exit. Kennedy's stomach twisted. She had walked right into a trap. Darius took a step forward, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. His face was calm. Too calm. "Didn't anyone tell you, Kennedy?" His voice was smooth even. "Some doors should stay closed." Kennedy forced herself to hold his gaze. "Yeah. And what happens when you open them?" A small smirk crossed his lips. "You don't always like what's on the other side." Deja squeezed Kennedy's wrist, whispering, "We should be running." Why aren't we running? Kennedy's mind raced. Darius wasn't attacking. He wasn't grabbing them, wasn't yelling, wasn't reaching for a weapon. That meant something. It meant he wasn't here to hurt them. At least, not yet. "You burned it down," Kennedy said. She didn't phrase it like a question. Darius tilted his head. "Did I?" Kennedy took a slow step forward. "Naomi's firm. The records. Everything. You made it disappear." Darius didn't deny it. His expression barely changed. "What did you find?" Kennedy's heart pounded. She knew what he was doing. He was testing her, trying to figure out how much she had already put together. So she made a gamble. "You were my father's lawyer." A sharp flicker of emotion crossed Darius's face, so fast she almost missed it. Kennedy's pulse spiked. Bingo. Deja's head snapped toward her. "Your what?" Kennedy didn't blink. "You worked for him, the man Naomi fought in court." Darius exhaled slowly. "You're a smart girl." Kennedy's chest tightened. "Who was he?" Darius glanced down at the burned floor. "Does it matter?" Kennedy's jaw clenched. "It does to me." Silence. For a second, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "His name was Richard Callaway." Kennedy's stomach dropped. That name, she had heard it before. Somewhere. Darius watched her closely, his hands still in his pockets. "You might not remember him, but he remembered you?" Kennedy's breath hitched. She tried to process, to make sense of it, but before she could ask another question, a car engine roared outside. Headlights cut through the broken windows. Darius's face shifted. The calm was gone. He pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper. He held it out. Kennedy hesitated. Then she took it. Darius's voice dropped to a whisper. "Run." The moment the word left his lips, the front doors burst open. Kennedy's instincts kicked in. She grabbed Deja's hand and ran. A voice shouted orders behind them. Heavy boots slammed against the floors. More than one person. Maybe three. Maybe more. Kennedy didn't look back. She sprinted through the burned-out building, weaving through the wreckage, her pulse racing. Deja panted beside her. "Who the hell are they?" "I don't know," Kennedy gasped, but she had a feeling. They weren't cops. Cops didn't show up without sirens. Cops didn't move like hunters. Kennedy skidded around a corner, nearly slipping on a pile of broken glass. The back door, almost there. Then, a gunshot, loud, close. Kennedy's heart stopped. Deja screamed. They ducked low, pressing themselves against the wall. The voices behind them were sharp, commanding. "Find them, now." Kennedy's pulse thundered in her ears. This wasn't a warning shot. They were trying to kill them. She turned to Deja. "We have to move, now." Deja's breath was ragged. "Where?" Kennedy's eyes flicked to the emergency exit ahead. A straight shot. One chance. "On three," she whispered. Deja nodded. "One." Footsteps got closer. "Two." A flashlight beam swept the room. "Three. Go!" They bolted. Kennedy heard shouts behind them, more gunshots, but she didn't stop. She slammed through the exit door, the cold night air hitting her face like a slap. The alley was empty. She didn't question it, didn't think. She just ran. They didn't stop running until they were 3 blocks away. Kennedy collapsed onto a bench, chest heaving. Deja bent over, hands on her knees. Never. Again. Kennedy barely heard her. Her hands shook as she pulled out the piece of paper Darius had given her. She unfolded it slowly. It was an old photograph. A woman holding a baby. A hospital room. Kennedy's heart nearly stopped. The woman was Naomi Carter. But the baby had a name written on the blanket. Callaway. Kennedy's hands trembled. Naomi Carter wasn't just her mother. She was hiding her father's identity. And Richard Callaway. Whoever he was. People were willing to kill to make sure Kennedy never found out. Kennedy couldn't breathe. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the photograph, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. Callaway. Her last name should have been Callaway. Not James. Not a random foster name assigned by the system. Her real name. Her real identity. The one Naomi Carter buried. Deja wiped sweat from her forehead, still panting. Okay, so, not to ruin the moment or anything, but we almost just got shot back there. And now, you're acting like you saw a ghost. Kennedy swallowed hard. I did. She turned the photograph toward Deja. Deja leaned in. The second she saw the name, her eyes widened. Wait. Callaway? Like the Callaways? As in the freaking billionaire Callaways? Kennedy's pulse spiked. That's where she had heard the name before. The Callaway family. Old money, major political influence, practically untouchable. They owned half the city. And if this photo was real, she wasn't just the daughter of a judge. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful families in the country. Deja's hands shot up. Nope, no. We are officially in get out before you disappear territory. You need to burn that picture and pretend you never saw it. Kennedy ignored her. She pulled out her phone and typed Richard Callaway into Google. Dozens of results popped up. Philanthropist, real estate mogul, former political donor. But something didn't make sense. She scrolled past the business articles, past the fake smiling photos, until she hit the real news. Missing. Richard Callaway, presumed dead after private jet crash. Kennedy's breath caught. The article was from 14 years ago, the same time she was born, the same time Naomi Carter fought a custody battle, the same time Naomi's law firm burned down. This wasn't a coincidence. Kennedy's stomach twisted. She wasn't just looking for a man. She was looking for a ghost. Kennedy sat in Jace's diner, her laptop open in front of her. She had spent the last 2 hours digging through articles, records, anything on Richard Callaway. The jet crash had been ruled an accident. Engine failure. No survivors. Case closed. But the deeper she looked, the less sense it made. The Callaway family had shut down the investigation within days. No bodies were ever found. And then, Naomi Carter had suddenly gone silent. She quit practicing law, became a judge, moved to a different city, like she was running, like she was hiding. Kennedy clenched her jaw. Naomi had lied to her for 14 years, and now she knew why. She was protecting Kennedy from the Callaways. But why? Jace slid into the seat across from her. You look like you just solved a murder. Kennedy exhaled sharply. Worse. She turned the screen toward him. Jace's eyebrows shot up. Whoa, that's Callaway? That's your dad? Kennedy nodded. And he disappeared the year I was born. Jace whistled low. Damn, that's a lot. Kennedy leaned in. I need to know what really happened to him, because if he's dead, why is someone still trying to keep me from finding out about him? Jace hesitated. You're asking the wrong question. Kennedy frowned. What do you mean? Jace drummed his fingers against the table. If someone is this desperate to keep you from looking into him, then maybe he's not dead at all. Kennedy froze. She hadn't even considered that. What if Richard Callaway was still alive? And what if the people chasing her were trying to make sure she never found him? That night, Kennedy lay awake in her apartment staring at the ceiling. Her mind wouldn't stop spinning. She had spent her whole life searching for answers, and now she had them. But the truth was even more dangerous than she thought. She reached for her phone. She didn't know what she was hoping for. Maybe another clue. Maybe some old document that would confirm what she was feeling. Instead, she saw a new text message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat. She opened it. Only 3 words. "Stop searching, Kennedy." Her breath caught. The text wasn't from Deja, or Jace, or even Naomi Carter, because at the bottom, it was signed. R.C. Kennedy's entire body went cold. R.C. Richard Callaway, her father. He was alive, and he was watching her. Kennedy's fingers trembled as she stared at the text message. R.C. Richard Callaway. Her father, alive. For 14 years she had thought she was abandoned, that she was unwanted. Now, everything had changed. Deja, sitting across from her, frowned at her phone screen. "Okay, I don't know what's worse, the fact that he's alive or the fact that he knows exactly where you are." Kennedy swallowed hard. He was watching. If he could send a message, it meant he had been close the entire time. She looked down at the text again. "Stop searching, Kennedy." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. But she wasn't stopping now. Not after coming this far. She took a shaky breath and typed back 1 word. "Why?" She stared at the screen, heart pounding. Waiting. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then, her phone buzzed again. A new message. "Meet me, 10 p.m., Pier 17. Come alone." Kennedy stood on the pier, the waves crashing against the wooden beams below. The night was cold, dark, the kind of dark that swallowed sound. She glanced around, searching the empty docks. Then, a shadow moved. A man stepped out from behind a stack of shipping crates. Tall, gray at the edges, a face worn with time, and eyes that looked exactly like hers. Richard Callaway. Kennedy's breath caught. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. But nothing had prepared her for the weight of it, for the silence between them, for the way he looked at her, not like a stranger, but like a father who had been forced to stay away. Richard exhaled. "You shouldn't be here." Kennedy swallowed. "Neither should you." A ghost of a smile flickered across his face. "Fair point." Kennedy's throat tightened. "Why did you let me think you were dead?" Richard's expression turned haunted. "Because I had to be." She clenched her fists. "Naomi lied to me my whole life. You did too. I deserve the truth." Richard's jaw tightened. He took a slow breath. Then, finally, he spoke. "Your mother and I were never supposed to be together." Kennedy blinked. "What?" Richard's voice was quieter now. "I was engaged to someone else. A marriage arranged by my family. A deal worth billions." Kennedy's stomach twisted. "And then," Richard continued, "I met Naomi." He looked away, like the memory was almost too much. "We were in love. We thought we could fight them." Kennedy exhaled. "And then she got pregnant." Richard nodded. "And suddenly, I wasn't just defying my family, I was breaking a contract that involved a lot of money and very dangerous people." Kennedy's pulse pounded. "You're saying the Callaways forced you to leave?" Richard's face darkened. "I'm saying they made sure I disappeared." Kennedy's breath caught. "The plane crash, that was them, wasn't it?" Richard nodded. "They staged it, made sure the world thought I was dead. They gave Naomi a choice, give you up or lose you forever." Kennedy's head spun. This wasn't just a cover-up. This was an entire life stolen from her. "Why didn't she tell me?" Kennedy whispered. Richard's voice was heavy. "Because she thought it was the only way to keep you safe." Kennedy clenched her fists. "Safe from what?" Richard's eyes flicked past her. Kennedy turned, just in time to see a second car pulling up at the docks. Black, tinted windows. Her stomach dropped. "They found us." The car doors swung open. 2 men stepped out. Kennedy didn't recognize them, but she recognized the look in their eyes. They weren't here to negotiate. Richard grabbed her arm. "We have to go." Kennedy's heart pounded. "We can't just run." Richard turned to her, urgency sharp in his voice. "There is no winning against them. The only way to survive is to disappear." Kennedy froze. Disappear. Leave everything behind. Erase her name. Erase her past. Live the way Richard had lived for 14 years. She had fought so hard to find the truth. But now, she had to decide. Was it worth dying for? The men moved closer. Kennedy's pulse thundered. She met Richard's gaze. And then, she made her choice. 1 year later. The diner was quiet. Jace wiped down the counter, flipping through the morning paper. His eyes skimmed the headlines. Judge Naomi Carter announces retirement after court scandal. Callaway family assets shift amid internal power struggles. He sighed, tossing the paper aside. Then the doorbell jingled. Jace glanced up and froze. A girl in a hoodie stood in the doorway. Hair shorter, face different, but the eyes, he knew those eyes. Kennedy. Alive. She smirked. "Miss me?" Jace blinked. "What the hell? Where have you been?" Kennedy slid into a seat. "Off the grid." Jace leaned in. "And now?" Kennedy's smirk faded. Now, she was back. Not for revenge, not for a fight, for closure. Because some secrets weren't meant to be buried. And some people weren't meant to stay hidden forever. Kennedy spent her whole life searching for answers about her past, her mother, and the identity that had been stolen from her. What she uncovered was far bigger than she ever imagined. A legacy built on lies, power, and betrayal. She learned the hard way that some truths are buried for a reason. But in the end, she made a choice. She didn't let the past define her. She didn't let fear control her. Instead, she rewrote her own story. She disappeared to survive. But now, she was back. Not for revenge, but to reclaim what was hers. Because no matter how deep the truth is buried, it always finds a way to rise. Want more stories filled with twists, secrets, and shocking endings? Subscribe now and never miss the next one. Or, if you're ready for your next mystery, click the next video now.